am Jessica Lockhart, and my paper is The Imperial Agenda of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Redefining African American Religious Identity 1870 to 1917. The post-emancipation African American cultural and intellectual community has long been viewed as a community lacking real agency, existing in a separate and lesser sphere than its white counterparts. This presumption, however, is not correct. Instead of seeing this community's identity as racial and national, it should be seen as a reflection of the imperialist mentality that consumed the white Atlantic world in the decades following the American Civil War and Reconstruction. This identity played out prominently in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Though the AME Church had existed since the early years of the United States, its most daunting challenge did not come until the post-emancipation era, when it charged itself with creating an identity for newly freed men and women in the American South. In order to create this identity, the AME Church leaders took to the emerging imperialist mentality as a means to reinvent themselves as American citizens. This identity was a result of both the evolution and timing of emancipation. Emancipation was not a single event, but a process. Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, and the 13th Amendment was passed 2 years later. These two events went only so far in abolishing slavery. Neither the Emancipation Proclamation nor the 13th Amendment defined the rights and roles of freed slaves. Because of this lack of definition, the African American community as a whole found itself in an identity crisis. Emancipation did not define who African Americans were. It defined who they were not. They were not slaves. Moreover, emancipation occurred just as imperialism was beginning to take hold of the Atlantic world. This exposure to the imperialist rhetoric and methodology at a crucial time in the formation of their identity led some African Americans to define themselves in similar terms as white Americans, who embraced the identity based on civilizing missions to explain their role in the world. The AME Church was a central organization in the African American community because it constituted one of the largest African American Christian denominations and was the largest African Methodist denomination after emancipation. The AME Church's large following, coupled with its push to publish and evangelize both domestically and abroad, allowed them to reach a broad audience. Through a study of the extensive speeches, writings, and publications from the AME Church's most prominent leaders, this paper argues that despite the tendency of previous historians to present African Americans as anti-imperialists who sought only to help the oppressed peoples of the world because of their shared history of discrimination and oppression, African Americans were actually exercising autonomy within the AME Church by participating in missionary activities both domestically and abroad. These missionary activities were not done merely because of Christian charity, but were a direct reflection of the official activities of the imperialist powers controlling the Atlantic world from 1870s through World War I. Imperialist rhetoric and methodology manifested itself in four distinct ways. Two of the most integral concepts to the theory of imperialism were social Darwinism and the white man's burden. Social Darwinism was the idea that some nations were more evolved than others, and those more evolved nations were more fit to rule than their lesser nations. Nations during this age were perceived to be almost synonymous with races. As cultural historian Mike Hawkins argues, what social Darwinism contributed to race theory was an apparently scientific rationale for racial hierarchy and a mechanism, the struggle for survival, for legitimating the predicated fate of blacks. In conjunction with this idea was the white man's burden, which held that it was the superior race's responsibility to civilize and uplift inferior races of the world. Though most of the concepts were racially based, gender differentiation also became an important component of imperialist rhetoric. The roles assigned to men and women became almost as important a justification for intervention as the desire to civilize. Nations and races began to be defined in terms of their ability to fill their roles as masculine protectors. Each of these four ideas was adopted and modified by the AME Church. The first of these tenets, social Darwinism, stood at the core of the AME Church's policy following emancipation. The AME Church Review published an article in 1893 that outlined its vision for the future of progress for the African American community. According to the author of the article, Professor D.J. Jordan, progress is the watchword of all existence. No such thing as rest or inactivity. The first principle or law of progress is unity. The second law of progress is frugality. The third law of national or racial progress is enlightenment. Though this publication came after the AME Church's policies had already begun taking shape, the importance of progress came to be the central platform of the church. By 1893, the AME Church leaders believed the time had come for a definition and plan of action to be presented to their congregation. The AME Church constructed its policies out of a desire to advance the standing of African Americans in the United States, guided by the principles outlined previously in the AME Church Review. These principles were grounded largely in the concepts of social Darwinism. The ironies and complexities that this concept created when applied to an oppressed race led the AME Church to consider policies for pushing the race from their inferior position to a superior one. In 1884, prominent AME Bishop Henry M. Turner said in an interview in the New York Times that the Negro is the junior race of the world. We have a great and grand future. According to Turner, though the black race did not currently hold a high status in the world, their future was looking brighter. He explained further, our race will be waxing for centuries after the white race will have commenced to wane. Bishop Turner's statement exposed the tension that lay at the heart of the AME Church's imperialist policy. They wanted to identify themselves with Christianized white Americans as civilized people, while also identifying with Africans as a part of the black race. Turner believed that under the leadership of the AME Church, the black race would become rulers of the world. According to the AME Church, African Americans' superiority to Africans lay in their Christianization. African Americans had not always been Christian, and it was through their experiences in North America and their interaction with white Americans that this revolution in their culture had occurred. Reverend Robert E. C. Ransom published a poem in the early 1900s entitled The New Negro, which addressed this cultural revolution. Ransom wrote, slavery was the chisel that fashioned him to form and gave him all the arts and sciences he had won. The lyncher, mob, and stake had been his emery wheel to make a polished man of strength and power. African Americans had undergone physical and mental changes during their tenure in North America. These changes were proof of advancement, and this advancement justified their dominion over Africans. A large portion of white Americans would have disagreed with statements regarding the fitness of African Americans, especially the belief that slavery had pushed them to this position. However, in the Centennial Encyclopedia issued by the Church in 1916 to celebrate 100 years of the Church's existence, Bishop Levi J. Copen in the introduction wrote, a glance at facts and figures cannot fail to convince the most stubborn unbeliever that our claim to manhood recognition is legitimate and just. Throughout the book, he used various charts and lists detailing the success of educational and evangelizing efforts. This information was meant to show the progression of the Church and its ability to reach vast numbers of people with both Christianity and education. The book also detailed many of the prominent leaders in the Church and their contribution to both the African American community and to the Atlantic world more broadly. Copen remarked on this by saying that evidences of innate qualities to warrant aspiration to the highest and best in human possibilities are not wanting in our race variety, and that the progress of 50 years of freedom is without a parallel in the records of history is also manifest. The Church believed that African Americans had accomplished more in less amount of time than whites. For white Americans, their progress from colony to free nation and empire had taken over 100 years. Comparatively, African Americans had been free for only 50 years and had accomplished more during this time than white Americans. Because of a shared religion and belief system, the AME Church leaders identified with America and Americans as Christians with an imperial mission to be both civilized and civilizers. This connection led the AME Church to conduct extensive missions to Africa. Bishop Levi J. Copen justified these missions by arguing that Africa was the dark continent, and that as Christians, the AME Church had the responsibility to bring religion and civilization to Africa. This was not the first time Africa had been referred to in such terms. In fact, the term dark continent was commonly used by white imperialists to justify missions to Africa. After performing an analysis of literature from the imperialist period, scholar Robert MacDonald concluded that many white imperialists believed that light must be brought to the dark continent, disorder ordered, filth cleared away, and the land made clean. The missionaries come, preach, convert, and civilize. The African is a wayward child in a time worthy of change. These viewpoints reflected the belief that Christianity was essentially a light for the uncivilized peoples of the world, and it was the responsibility of all Christian missionaries to take this light to them. Copen also believed that Africans desired this civilized intervention. The AME Church's dedication to this imperialist identity may best be exemplified in this statement from Pastor Henry Parks. The AME Church is confronted with responsibilities as broad as the new American policy of empire. It stands on the threshold of a policy of expansion. Africa, the second largest continent of the world, is the new colonial possession of the missionary department of the AME Church. Opinions such as these represent a certain degree of arrogance. They were the results of a belief that inferior races of the world desire the status of the self-proclaimed superior. This feeling of superiority was spawned from what AME Church leaders saw as marked progress in shaping the African American community into a fitter race in the United States. Though some members of the AME Church chose to use friendly language when referring to their African counterparts, others were less forgiving with their words. Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne wrote in a sacred ode, "May the cause of missions here, bid homeborn heathens and the pagans far, receive the light of Zion's blazing star." The language used here was harsh, but not unlike the language used by white Americans in the Philippines. Congressional speeches reveal that the Filipinos were often considered barbarous and undeveloped. This arrogant belief led many to take up the banner of the white man's burden. This concept was adopted wholeheartedly by the AME Church with a revised title, The Black Man's Burden, which appeared in a poem by Minister J. Dallas Bowser entitled Take Up the Black Man's Burden. The tenets of the theory were almost identical to their white counterpart, except that the AME Church claimed that Africa was meant to be civilized by African Americans, not white imperialists. This defiance questioned the racial supremacy that whites claimed over African Americans. Bowser argued that since being freed, African Americans had been striving towards white civility, and by civilizing Africa, they were realizing this goal. The AME Church believed that Africa needed guidance. AME chaplain Theophilus Gold Stewart argued in several sermons that the congregation must not simply evangelize in Africa, but organize them into churches and societies in accordance with the Methodist discipline. They wanted to place Africa under their leadership until they believed that they were fit to govern themselves. This may have seemed odd because in the United States, most African Americans were not fully able to participate in the democratic system. Because of the Jim Crow laws in the South, African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were confined socially, politically, and physically. Bishop Levi J. Copeland, along with other AME church leaders, began to see that the key to escaping this undesirable position was through Christianity and ultimately this white notion of civilization. If African Americans could prove that they were a civilized people as capable of imperialist agendas as their white brethren, then they could secure their place in society. Civility was largely measured in racial terms. However, other than the obvious racial terms of imperialism, work in Africa was often painted in terms of gender. For many of the Atlantic countries, defining groups in terms of gender roles and emphasizing male duty served as a cornerstone of their imperialist policies. United States intervention in Cuba had been conducted with the belief that honor as a nation was tied to their sense of manhood and their duty to protect the lesser. While white males were playing the role of masculine saviors, black men were attempting to find an outlet for their own manhood. For those living in the U.S. during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, providing for their families and fulfilling traditional head of household roles was difficult. Intervention abroad allowed African American males to serve as protectors of damsels, despite their lack of acknowledgement in their home country, and the denial by whites of the formal markers of manhood in the United States. These actions allowed the AME Church to defy the very reasoning behind Jim Crow laws. They argued that in Africa they were masculine and fit to stand before kings. These descriptions defied the argument by white Americans that Jim Crow laws were justified because African Americans were not fully men. The men that evangelized abroad and those that chose to pursue progress in the face of Jim Crow policies could serve as role models for African Americans in the same way that white males hoped war heroes would serve as models of manhood for young white males. According to Reverend B.W. Roberts, the great one of our race is true manhood, an enlightened, educated, and inspired Christian character. Above everything, what we need as a race is a manly character. Females also sought agency through missionary work. According to the head of the missions department, Sarah Duncan, female virtues were the basis by which races are judged. By protecting Christian virtues and promoting them abroad, the AME Church could show true progress. After emancipation, African Americans had an ambiguous position in American society. The African Methodist Episcopal Church sought to remedy this identity crisis by imitating the actions of white society in the Atlantic world. This mimicry was meant not only to provide an identity for African Americans, but also allow for social mobility and acceptance. The issues involved with Jim Crow and African American agency in the United States led the African Methodist Episcopal Church to adopt imperialist policies in an attempt to create a place for African Americans to exercise agency, while also providing them with the possibility of acceptance in the United States. When Jim Crow laws began to hamper the community, the AME Church leaders pushed imperialism even more, calling for the publication of various texts describing the enlightened development of African Americans. This push for publication proved that the church and its congregation had truly bought into the imperialist ideas of social Darwinism and racial progression. They were in essence attempting to prove to their fellow white citizens that they had achieved the same level of racial success, therefore they deserved to be treated as equally civilized people. This was not to be, however. Despite the profoundly thorough and organized efforts of the church to redefine African Americans religiously, the AME Church was not able to gain African Americans'